There are places on Earth that never needed humans to name them, because their silence alone carries a story longer than any written chronicle. On the pale, wind-swept plateau of Anatolia, around the year 9,600 before the Common Era, a small, unassuming hill kept its secret tucked beneath a thin crust of soil for 12,000 years. No lights, no walls, no sound of tools breaking ground, only stone, wind, and something patient, waiting just beneath the surface. When history tells the story of civilization, it usually begins with wheat, then villages, then sacred structures. But Göbekli Tepe appears like a sentence written out of order, or rather, a reminder that some turning points in humanity happened long before we understood why they were possible at all. This monument rose in an age when people were not yet settled, not yet domesticating plants or animals, not yet shaping even the first brick of architecture. In this landscape that seems barren from afar, the tall T-shaped pillars emerge with a balance too deliberate to be accidental. The carvings, foxes, aurochs, snakes, vultures, cut as sharply as a chisel's edge, do not depict hunting scenes. They read instead like symbols from a spiritual world formed long before writing existed. There are no fire pits here, no roofs, no traces of daily life. Everything about this place suggests it was made for one purpose alone: the experience of the sacred. The most haunting question is not about its ancient age, but about how mobile hunter-gatherer groups, with no kings, no states, no metal, could join together to build a structure far beyond survival needs. What drew them to this dry, windswept hill? What compelled them to carve meaning into stone long before they carved it into language? Perhaps the truest force was not the need to survive, but the need to connect with what couldn't be seen. Long before wheat grew into fields, long before humans gathered into villages, they felt the urge to carve out a space where they could reach toward a world beyond their sight. Göbekli Tepe is not just the first monument. It is the oldest footprint of humanity's search for meaning. And then, around 8,000. Before the Common Era, when their world began to shift, they buried the entire site. Not through destruction, but through a careful ritual, putting it to rest the moment its purpose was complete. Now, as our journey begins, we stand before a quiet reminder left by time. The past is wider than any map, deeper than any timeline, and it reveals itself only when we slow down enough to feel the breath of those who lived 12,000 years before us. And to hear that breath clearly, we must return to the place where it all began, the silent hill where stone never spoke, yet history slowly opened its door. Long before the first stone pillars brushed the light of the modern sun, Göbekli Tepe appeared to be nothing more than a quiet mound on the Urfa Plateau, a place people walked past without slowing down, where shepherds paused only to find a sliver of shade during scorching afternoons. For thousands of years it rested there, unshowy, uninviting, as if it knew its moment had not yet arrived. On the surface, everything looked deceptively simple. Scatterings of limestone rubble, thin layers of wind-worn soil, and a few bones mixed into the pale ground, all of it suggesting nothing more than seasonal stopping points. Nothing hinted that beneath this thin crust lay a structure capable of shaking the entire timeline of post-Ice Age archaeology. The Urfa Plateau has a strange kind of beauty, dry, bare, and older than it seems. Under the sun, The soft curves of limestone make you feel as if you're standing on the exposed backbone of the earth. Land once squeezed by glacial ice, now uncovered by a warming world. Since around 11,000 before the Common Era, hunter-gatherer groups moved across this landscape, carrying with them the restless rhythm of a life that did not yet know what a permanent home was. That quiet surface, though, hid something far greater. From a distance, the mound looked ordinary, but if you stood long enough, you could notice a few upright stones protruding at odd angles, or gentle swells in the ground, as if something beneath was pushing upward. Subtle signs, easy to overlook, yet strange enough to feel like a held breath beneath the soil. Its location was no accident either. Perched where small valleys converge, where the wind runs clean and the view opens in all directions, the hill was a perfect vantage point, a place to observe, to gather, or to build something meant to rise toward the sky. Perhaps ancient people sensed what we only understand now, after stitching together the clues. Yet for countless centuries, no one dug. Those quiet signs remained unnoticed, softened by wind, blurred by time. Sometimes a secret survives, not because it is guarded, but because no one ever thinks to search for it. Then, one day in 1994, the silence cracked. A man noticed a stone jutting out of the ground in a way that did not look natural, and that single moment was enough to overturn the history of archaeology. A hill once dismissed as ordinary suddenly opened a doorway into a time deeper than civilization's memory. And from that moment, the first question rose like a long shadow across the earth. If this is where humans chose to build a sacred space before wheat, before houses, before metal, what force led them here? To find the answer, we must follow the footsteps of the man who first noticed what everyone else had overlooked. And from there, the true story of Göbekli Tepe begins to unfold. In the summer of 1994, as the Anatolian sunlight slid across the dry, wind-bitten hills, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived in the Schönlurfa region for a survey he didn't expect much from. The limestone hills here always looked the same, rough, pale, wind-worn, usually hiding nothing more than scattered fragments from later ages. On the map, this place was labeled with a casual note: limestone mound, some pottery. No one had ever bothered to look closer, but Schmidt was different. He noticed a stone jutting from the hillside, too straight, too sharp, too intentional to be shaped by nature alone. When he brushed aside the thin layer of soil, the carved curve beneath it was so precise, it stopped his breath. A few more stones, another slight clearing, and he understood. He wasn't standing on an ordinary hill. He was standing on the roof of something built by human hands. What stunned him most was the contradiction between these crafted stones and the emptiness around them. No houses, no hearths, no walls, no foundations, nothing suggesting a community had ever lived here. And yet these stones were too large, too refined, their edges too clean to be dismissed as accidents of nature. The hill felt less like a natural rise and more like a mound deliberately raised over something important. When Schmidt lifted another piece of stone, the first carvings came into view. A fox captured mid-stride, and a snake curling as if alive under the sun. These were unlike any motifs from the Byzantine era or the Bronze Age. They belonged to a world far older, the world of pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, the very society Schmidt had spent his life studying. In that moment, the age of the stones seemed to flare in his mind. They couldn't be 2,000 years old. They couldn't be 5,000. They must reach back to around 10,000 years before the Common Era, a time when, according to everything scholars believed, humanity had never built large stone structures at all. These carvings were not just ancient. They came from the razor-thin boundary between the Ice Age and the warming world that followed, a period nearly blank in the archaeological record. Schmidt stood still, letting the heat of the plateau wash over his hands. A part of him wanted to doubt the sight before him, but a deeper part, the instinct of someone who had devoted his life to prehistory, knew he was facing a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. Beneath his feet lay a secret that had slept for more than 10 millennia, now blinking open for the first time. He could have walked away, as many archaeologists had before him, leaving the hill to remain silent for another generation. But Schmidt did not move. Something in this place held him, not by logic, but by the quiet certainty that, if he turned his back now, history would close the door it had only just opened. And so, with the simple decision to stay, the first layers of soil were about to be lifted. In just a few moments, the Anatolian sun would shine onto a fragment of the past the archaeological world believed impossible, and from that moment onward, the story of humanity would never again be written the same way. When the first samples of organic charcoal were sent to the lab, the excavation team expected a familiar result, perhaps 6,000 or 5,000 years before the Common Era, an era when people were farming, building homes, and shaping simple stone structures. No one imagined a date far beyond that range. But when the results came back, the room fell silent. 9,600 years before the Common Era. A number that didn't just exceed expectations. It broke the timeline archaeology had relied on for decades. Schmidt reread the paper again and again, each time trying to let his heartbeat catch up with a number that threatened to reshape the entire prehistoric world. If these pillars truly belonged to the period between 9,600 and 8,800 years, before the Common Era, then this place existed before agriculture, before permanent villages, before the wheel, before pottery, before the idea that humans were even capable of building something meant to last for millennia. It forced history to question itself. Perhaps ritual did not come after society. Perhaps ritual created society. As the news spread, shock rippled across the academic world. Not because bold theories were rare, but because no framework of social evolution had ever predicted something like this. Scholars had long believed that people only considered building temples after they had already settled down. Yet here, a spiritual vision appeared in the middle of the hunter-gatherer world, a call that seemed strong enough to change the very direction of human history. On the ground at Göbekli Tepe, the age of the site was written in thick layers of sediment, stacked like chapters of collective memory. This was not natural soil. It was soil intentionally placed, compacted, gathered, mixed with broken stone and animal bones from multiple periods. Each layer marked a generation returning to this hill to renew a sacred tradition carried across thousands of years. Schmidt began to realize he was not standing before the remains of an advanced society. He was witnessing the birth of collective thought. These pillars, nearly 3 meters tall and weighing tens of tons, arranged in circles with precise spacing, were not the result of chance. They followed a plan, a design. No writing existed here, yet there were rules. No drawings survived, yet intention was everywhere. The strangest part was this. Around 9,000 years before the Common Era, humans were still living nomadic lives, following gazelle herds, gathering wild berries, lighting fires in shifting valleys. And yet the monument before him demanded coordination far beyond anything a small, wandering band could achieve. This opened an astonishing possibility. Perhaps the search for shared meaning had pulled people together into a larger community. Long before agriculture ever took root, the archaeological numbers were no longer just data. They were a door opening onto a period when humanity had not yet named itself. And that door widened further as the circular structures emerged from the earth, stone walls standing in silence since long before history began to write its own lines. And now, as the first light reached the faces of the T-shaped pillars, a new question rose from the dust. By what logic were these circles built? And for whom? To find that answer, we must step into the very space those prehistoric builders carved as the beating heart of their sacred hill. When the first layers of soil were peeled away, the outline of an unfamiliar space slowly emerged. Not the remains of a village, nor the traces of any defensive structure. Seen from above, Göbekli Tepe resembles a constellation of interlocking circles, large enough that only the cooperation of dozens of groups across many generations could have built them. And their age, dating between 9,600 and 8,800 years before the Common Era, places these rings among the earliest intentional architectural creations in human history. At the center of each circle stand two massive pillars, facing one another like silent presences, anchors not only of the space, but of the spirit guiding it. Around them sit smaller pillars, set into deep foundation pits and reinforced with rubble. Every detail makes it clear. This was not the makeshift project of a seasonal hunting band, but a sustained intellectual investment carried across centuries, something nearly unthinkable for a mobile society. What astonishes most is the structural unity. Each circle opens toward the center, the entrance narrows, and the pillars form a clean, steady arc. There are no interior rooms, no signs of habitation. Everything feels arranged so that the eyes, footsteps, and attention of every person would naturally converge on the middle, where the two great pillars rise like a threshold between the human world and something beyond it. The surfaces of the pillars reveal a level of craftsmanship that cannot be dismissed as primitive. Long, flat planes, sharp edges, smooth curves, all carved using stone tools, yet executed with a precision that would make even modern artisans pause. The way the pillars are balanced, fixed, and set up right shows an understanding of material, weight, and technique at a time when humanity had no wheels, no metal, and no pulleys. Researchers have noticed that many circles open toward the east or northeast, hinting at possible connections to astronomical events such as sunrise on particular days of the year. There is no absolute proof, but the repetition of this orientation makes it difficult to ignore the idea that the sky played a significant role in shaping the architecture. Stepping into the center of one of these rings, you do not feel sheltered. You feel invited to experience something larger than yourself. The open space, the towering pillars, the cool stone, the way the light falls from above, and the whisper of wind threading through the carved surfaces all create a different kind of silence, a silence designed. This is architecture not meant to protect the body, but to lift the mind, For that reason, the circular architecture of Göbekli Tepe stands as one of the clearest markers of a cognitive shift in the post-Ice Age world. Even without permanent settlements, people had begun choosing fixed points for all groups to return to, a center defined not by survival, but by meaning. And from these first circles, the idea of a shared community may have emerged for the very first time. And as we move closer to the great pillars, at the heart of each ring, where animal carvings sit as if waiting for someone to read them, a quiet, deeper question begins to rise. Perhaps these stones are not only structures, but the faces, stories, and spirits our earliest ancestors left behind for us to find. When the final layers of soil slipped away from the surfaces of the T-shaped pillars, their forms appeared with a refinement that could silence anyone who looked at them. These stones, rising from 3 to nearly 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, carried soft curves, crisp edges, and meticulously carved planes, as if their makers had spent countless days shaping the exact form they believed worthy. The heads of the pillars widen, the bodies taper, the bases flare gently, creating a stance that resembles a human figure standing upright and steady. What puzzled archaeologists was not only the size, but the logic behind this shape. The 2 central pillars in every circle share the same geometric language: minimalist, without faces, without eyes or mouths. Only the faint suggestion of shoulders along the edges and a slender torso hinted by the flat front. These are not human statues. They are representations of something beyond the individual, a symbolic form the community placed at the heart of their rituals, as if embodying a presence greater than themselves. A few pillars carry rare details: arms carved down the sides, hands resting near the lower abdomen, belts etched lightly across the waist, and sometimes even a stone loincloth. These additions make the pillars feel more human, but not enough to turn them into portraits. Instead, they resemble figures positioned at the boundary between the visible and the invisible, where humans recognize themselves, yet sense something more powerful standing alongside them. Their placement reinforces this idea. The 2 central pillars always face one another, like a pair of beings guiding or witnessing a ceremony. The smaller outer pillars form a ring of silent onlookers. There are no offerings, no altars, no signs of worship through objects. The emptiness of the space, the curve of the circle, and the twin stone figures all seem crafted to bring people into an experience woven from light, shadow, and silence. Many scholars believe the lack of facial features was intentional, not a limitation. If a divine figure had a face, it would become individual. But here, the sacred was defined by form, not by image. This reflects the spirit of a world before writing. Symbols had to be universal, something every visiting group across the plateau could understand, no matter where they came from. When the sun tilted toward evening, the T-pillars cast long shadows across the rubble floor. In that golden light, the carved lines sharpen like the edge of a blade, creating the uncanny feeling that you are standing not in front of stone, but before an invisible gaze. Each pillar becomes a column of memory, mute yet enduring, holding stories repeated by countless generations. What is extraordinary is that this motif appears not in a single circle, but in multiple layers of construction, separated by centuries. This tells us that these pillars were not the invention of one group, but a stable symbolic tradition, a shared visual language preserved through time, outlasting any changes in social organization. And from these stone hands, from these faceless yet deeply human shapes, we step further into the language our ancestors left behind. A world carved not in letters, but in animals, where living creatures carried the voice of an age long before writing was born. When the first light poured over the newly uncovered stone surfaces, the carvings emerged with a sharpness that made people hold their breath. Lions, wild boars, foxes, aurochs, gazelles, vultures, snakes. Each creature appears alone, as if lifted out of time itself. These are not narrative scenes, not decorations. They are the visual language of a world without writing, where symbols were entrusted to stone so they could outlast every human memory. The precision in every chiseled line shows that the people who made them did more than observe animals. They understood them deeply. The curve of a gazelle's horn, the raised fur of a fox on alert, the fluid tension of a snake poised to shift its body. This is the eye of people who lived intimately with nature. Yet when these carvings are placed into their positions on the pillars, what emerges is not ecological knowledge, but a fully formed symbolic system. On several large pillars, the carvings occupy the most prominent space, as if carrying a message that rises beyond the material world. A vulture spreads its wings. Beneath it, a human figure lies horizontally. A rare motif, but one that strongly hints at a belief in a journey from earth to sky. Here, animals are no longer prey. They become mediators between worlds, embodiments of natural forces that shaped the consciousness of the late Ice Age. Snakes are the most frequent. For people of 9,600 to 8,800 years. Before the Common Era, snakes were not simply threats. They represented transformation, the realm beneath the surface, the rhythm of renewal felt through every season. When snake patterns ripple down the pillars, they feel like currents moving between layers of reality. An unseen world the ancestors believed lived below the silent ground. What astonishes most is how every animal is detached from its environment. No plains, no rocks, no hunting sequences like those in the caves of Lascaux. Each creature stands alone, as if embodying a trait, a force, an idea. Here, symbolic thinking has broken free from literal reality, a profound leap in cognition, where humans begin assigning abstract meaning to the natural world. At times, rare species appear, like the Anatolian leopard, already declining by this era. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe did not belong to a single group. Many communities from different landscapes likely came here, bringing their own symbols, merging them into the shared language of stone that encircled the hill. What lingers most is the silence of these carved beings. No motion, no story, no interaction. They stand still like characters in an alphabet from a lost way of thinking. Each carving is a word no one remembers how to pronounce, an idea waiting for someone to rediscover. And when we realize that these symbols were not the work of one generation, but carved over centuries, a question begins to awaken. Quiet, but sharp as the Anatolian wind. How did a community without villages, without rulers, without metal, manage to work together long enough to turn stone into language and build something far beyond the limits of their era? That question opens the next doorway, where the organization, skill, and collective spirit of these ancient people begin to reveal themselves. When you stand before the T-shaped pillars, some rising nearly 5 meters high, weighing more than 15 tons, The first question always rises like a quiet shock. How could seasonal hunter-gatherers, with no fields, no livestock, no metal, and no permanent homes, create something this far beyond survival? Every old theory about simple foraging societies seems to crumble the moment you look at Göbekli Tepe. Traditionally, hunter-gatherer bands rarely exceeded a few dozen people, moving constantly to follow migrating herds. They had no reason to stay in one place for weeks, let alone months or years, to build a massive project. Yet nothing about this site feels improvised. Quarrying, hauling stone, setting foundations, arranging the layout, all of it required coordination, planning, and a shared purpose across multiple groups converging at the same time. Researchers now believe each stone circle may have required several hundred people working together. This could only happen if the migration routes of the late Ice Age intersected at this hill, turning Göbekli Tepe into a seasonal gathering point for communities that did not share a common homeland or language. They arrived from different regions, carrying their own symbols, and together created something far larger than any one group, a shared spiritual center. One major theory suggests that the act of building itself created social unity. When hundreds of people cut stone, pulled pillars, shared tools, and physical strain, they were forced into division of labor, mutual reliance, and a new kind of soft social structure, not yet a village, but no longer separate, drifting bands. In other words, instead of complex society producing temples, perhaps the temple produced complex society. The way they moved the stones reveals an astonishing creativity. With no wheels, no metal, they used wooden levers, limestone sledging tracks, stone anchors, and plant fiber ropes. Techniques simple on the surface, yet effective enough to impress modern engineers. This proves something profound. Human intelligence doesn't depend on technology. It depends on what people believe is worth their effort. Yet the deepest mystery is not the technique. It is the motivation. Why devote such enormous energy to a place that wasn't meant for living? No houses, no hearths, no signs of daily life, meaning the site served not the body, but the mind. Something invisible but powerful enough to draw scattered groups toward a single hilltop. And this leads to the question at the heart of Göbekli Tepe. What brought them here? To pray? To remember? To cross into a state of consciousness we no longer have words for? The answer is not in the stones, but in the traces of feasting left behind. Massive gatherings of hundreds of people sharing meat, fire, and ritual, where celebration and labor fused into two halves of a single ancient vow. And by following the scent of those ancient feasts, we step toward an entirely new doorway, the world of humanity's earliest known rituals. When the refuse pits surrounding the stone circles were uncovered, the first thing that stunned archaeologists was not tools or pottery, but the sheer volume of animal bones, enough to blanket the ground in every direction. Hundreds of gazelles, wild boars, aurochs, large birds, all slaughtered within the same narrow window of time. The scale far exceeded what any small band of people could consume. It could only belong to enormous gatherings, moments when many communities paused their travels before beginning a shared task. Cut marks on the bones show a unified method of butchering, stripping, and cooking, as if the ritual had been repeated dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. This makes one thing clear. Göbekli Tepe was not a place of residence. It was a place of events, seasonal or cyclical gatherings, tied to moments that people believed echoed the rhythms of the sky and earth. A kind of prehistoric festival where food, fire, and ritual renewed the bonds that held different groups together. These feasts acted as a binding force for hunter-gatherer communities scattered across the post-Ice Age landscape. In a world where food shifted with the seasons, people had to break into small groups to survive. But when hundreds sat around the fire, sharing meat and stories, they created something no animal group ever could: a sense of belonging to a community larger than kinship or tribe. Many scholars believe these feasts served as the social engine that kept the monument alive. People gathered to perform rituals, then used that same gathering to mobilize manpower for building. Afterward, they feasted again to reaffirm trust, unity, and commitment. Over centuries, this cycle repeated, layering Göbekli Tepe with generations of communal effort, as if the ritual itself gave birth to the architecture, not the other way around. Evidence of fermented wild grains strengthens this theory. In several pits, researchers found traces of a lightly fermented drink, the earliest ancestor of beer. It wasn't strong, but enough to relax the body, soften tension, and help people blend into the emotional atmosphere of the ritual. This suggests that grains may not have been cultivated first for food, but for ceremony, an idea that turns the traditional logic of agriculture upside down. Ash pits, heated stones, charred bone fragments, all hint at the presence of multiple groups. Each community brought animals familiar to their own region, contributing to a rich mosaic of shared feasting. When the meat was divided and the fire illuminated the carved pillars, they were not simply eating. They were reaffirming their dedication to a site that stood above tribal boundaries. Picture the scene 10,000 years ago. Dozens of fires flickering around the stone circles, the hiss of roasting meat, the scent of smoke mixing with dry grass, and the vast Anatolian night sky stretching like a silent canopy overhead. In that moment, Göbekli Tepe was no longer stone. It was the heartbeat of a people learning to become more than themselves. And from those glowing feasts, a quiet question begins to rise. Whose hands lifted the pillars, hauled the stones, and set them with such precision? Who transformed ritual into reality? And how did they coordinate such colossal labor in a world without metal, wheels, or permanent settlements? The answer lies deep within the monument itself, where the traces of labor whisper a different story, quieter, but no less extraordinary. When archaeologists examined the shallow rock trenches a few hundred meters from Göbekli Tepe's central circles, they realized they were standing inside the main quarry used by the builders. Half-cut limestone blocks lay scattered across the ground, like abandoned drafts, suggesting something unmistakable. The people who worked here did not carve at random. They had a designated quarry, a practice technique, and, most importantly, a system. Judging from cut marks, wear patterns, and the angles of extraction, specialists estimate that each large pillar would have required 30 to 50 people pulling in unison with ropes. With no wheels, no sleds, and no metal tools, they relied on the smooth limestone bedrock, wooden levers, stop stones, and temporary paths paved with rubble. Every step demanded an acute understanding of weight, traction, and rhythm. This was not the work of a small band. It was the outcome of coordinated labor in which every individual understood their role. What makes the site even more remarkable is what it lacks. There is no trace of a ruling class, no large houses, no elite compounds, nothing suggesting centralized authority. All the evidence points to a construction effort rooted in voluntary cooperation, not coercion. A society long assumed to be simple and loosely organized suddenly reveals a level of structure that surpasses expectations. Small technical grooves around the quarry, flattened work areas, and temporary transport lanes show how the builders adapted to the landscape with precision. They engineered slopes, managed momentum, and learned to twist massive stones into place. These skills did not come from formal training, but from lived experience, likely accumulated over hundreds of seasonal gatherings. This raises a profound question. Who taught them? There are no signs of schools, no master builders buried with honors. The knowledge seems to have grown organically, passed down as elders taught younger members how to lever stone, while new hands learn to shape blocks, refine surfaces, and perfect techniques with each returning season. Another possibility is that the knowledge came collectively. Groups from the mountains may have contributed quarrying skills. Those from the plains brought transport techniques. Those living near rivers understood scaffolding and leverage. In this view, Göbekli Tepe becomes not only a sacred center, but a crossroads of knowledge, a kind of invisible school where expertise lived in memory, muscle, and shared tradition rather than in written instructions. All of this coordination reveals a striking truth. Their motivation was not material. They did not build to live here. They did not build to defend themselves. They built because they shared a belief in the site's spiritual importance. The weight of the stones was matched by the weight of their conviction. Through the labor, they forged not only architecture, but unity, a feeling that they were part of something larger than any one group. And from that collective effort, a quiet question begins to rise. Were they merely constructing a structure? Or were they creating a place where the human spirit could touch the sacred? The answer lies within the stone circles themselves, where traces of ritual still linger like the faint breath of a world that has slept for 12,000 years. When you step into the center of a stone circle at Göbekli Tepe, you are not overwhelmed by size. You are disarmed by the feeling that you have entered a space designed to guide the mind. The entrances are narrow, the floor slopes gently downward, and everyone who crosses that threshold is led, almost instinctively, toward the twin T-shaped pillars at the center. The entire layout shapes the movement of the body, turning each step into part of a ritual, as if anyone who entered was meant to face whatever sacred meaning the community once placed at the heart of the circle. Archaeology tells us this was not a place for daily life. There are no hearths, no ashes, no scattered tools, and no signs of long-term dwelling. The space is intentionally clean, empty, and silent. This suggests that throughout the long span from 9,600 to 8,800 before the Common Era, these circles served one purpose only: ceremony. They were never built for living, only for connecting with something beyond life itself. The two central pillars seem to have been the main focus of those ceremonies. The way they face each other, the way the smaller pillars align toward them, hints that people may have gathered in a closed ring, all eyes turned toward the two stone figures at the center. This was not a place to observe the outside world. It was a place to witness the quiet, sacred movement inside oneself, reflected through symbols the community believed carried their deepest meaning. What stands out is the spaciousness of each circle. large enough for many people to stand, move, or take part in a sequence of ritual actions. These ceremonies may have marked the shifts of seasons, the passage into adulthood, or moments related to death. Thresholds that hunter-gatherer communities often saw as gateways between two realms, the world of the living and the dim boundary of the spirit world. Many pillars contain small holes or shallow grooves. These marks suggest they once held organic materials like wood, animal hides, feathers, or rough cloth. If so, the circles were far more vibrant and alive than the bare stones we see today. With organic materials hanging, tied, and moving with the wind, the space may have resembled a ritual house, where stone symbols and soft textures blended into a single sacred scene. Some structures even show a connection to light. The orientation of the circles and the position of their central pillars hint that sunrise on certain special days may have shone directly onto key points within the space. If true, the builders used light as a marker of time, turning the site into a kind of natural calendar, an observatory whose purpose was not scientific, but spiritual. Taken together, the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe were not architecture for use. They were architecture for experience. People entered not for shelter, but to feel themselves become part of a larger rhythm, the rhythm of community, of nature, of the unseen world they believed moved through everything around them. In that silence, they rediscovered the connection that months of scattered hunting life often dimmed. And from that experience, a clearer question emerges. Why did they believe ritual had to be built before the very places they lived? Why did the sacred come before farming, before villages, before all familiar structures of society? The answer begins to appear when archaeologists place Göbekli Tepe into the broader arc of human development, where a bold possibility takes shape. Religion may have paved the way for settled society, not the other way around. Before Göbekli Tepe was excavated, human history seemed to follow an unbreakable sequence. Farming created settlement. Settlement created villages. Villages created monuments, and only then did ritual appear. But the massive stone circles built between 9,600 and 8,800 before the Common Era shattered that entire order. At a time when archaeology once believed humans were barely surviving, we find instead a ceremonial center, wide, intricate, and far beyond the minimum needs of a hunter-gatherer society. No fields of grain, yet there was a temple. No village, yet there was a gathering place. No storage pits, yet there were sacred pillars. These contradictions led to a bold possibility. Ritual may have created agriculture, not the other way around. When hundreds of people traveled from different regions to gather at Göbekli Tepe in recurring cycles, they faced a serious challenge. How do you secure a food supply large enough and reliable enough to sustain repeated ceremonies? Hunting could provide great feasts, but it depended on seasons and luck. If ritual was sacred, they needed a source that did not bow to nature's unpredictability. That spiritual pressure quietly became economic pressure. The strongest evidence supporting this theory lies right beneath the hill. Wild einkorn wheat from the period 8,800 to 8,200. Before the Common Era shows signs of morphological change, the earliest markers of domestication. And the region surrounding Göbekli Tepe is the closest known origin point of modern wheat. Suddenly, the picture becomes clearer. The people who gathered here may have begun planting crops to ensure that sacred gatherings would never be interrupted. If that is true, agriculture was not the goal. It was the solution, a way to preserve the sacred. This perspective flips the old understanding entirely. Instead of complex society giving rise to religion, here, the spiritual need itself pushed people to change their way of life, shifting from pure hunting to the intentional cultivation of plants. The search for meaning came before the search for material stability. The idea of the sacred became the foundation for settlement, not an ornament added after society matured. And once people began learning how to farm, the role of Göbekli Tepe slowly faded. Communities that once climbed the hill seasonally began living permanently in the valleys, creating new rituals tied to planting, harvest cycles, and the rhythms of the fields. The hill, once the center of a mobile world, gradually lost its purpose. But instead of abandoning it and letting time swallow it, they did something astonishing. They buried the entire complex with their own hands, intentionally, layer by layer, as if performing a farewell ritual once its sacred role had been fulfilled. Why bury an entire sanctuary? Why not let it stand as a memory? The answer lies in the moment. Göbekli Tepe closed, like a sacred book whose final chapter has been written, ready to be returned to the earth from which it first rose. When the final layers of earth were lifted from the stone surface of Göbekli Tepe, what emerged was not the erosion of time, but the trace of a profound decision made 10,000 years ago. The 2-meter-thick fill contained countless pieces of broken stone, poured in stages, mixed with animal bones, snapped tools, and soil carried in from the surrounding hills. There is no sign of natural sedimentation. Each layer feels like a layer of consciousness, ordered, rhythmic, intentional, revealing that this was a purposeful burial. Carbon dating places the fill between 8,200 and 8,000 before the Common Era, long after the earliest stone circles were built. This means the site was revered for many generations before new communities, now experimenting with plant domestication and living near water sources, chose to close it, not by destroying it, not by abandoning it, but through a calm, deliberate ritual, as if escorting an entire era to its resting place after its purpose had been fulfilled. The care behind this act shows in every small detail. The rubble was poured in without breaking the pillars. The fill rose gradually from the base to the top, as though they wished to protect the structure's shape during its long sleep. There are no signs of violence, no blows, no fractures. They did not seek to erase, they sought to preserve. That gentleness is why the carvings remain sharp, even after 10 millennia beneath the earth. Many scholars believe this burial marks a deep shift in how people understood their world. As they moved into the valleys, closer to fertile soils and the cycles of seasonal rain, they no longer needed a wind-swept hilltop for gatherings. A ceremonial center built for a hunter-gatherer life had completed its role. The shift in thinking, from wind to water, from movement to settlement, required a new sacred landscape. But what makes this burial ritual extraordinary is the spiritual depth behind it. In many ancient cultures, when a sacred place no longer serves the living, it is not abandoned. It is closed through ceremony. To bury is not to forget. It is to honor. It is how a community allows the past to become a foundation rather than a burden. Another theory suggests they wanted to protect the site from the eyes of future generations. generations that might no longer share the same beliefs. When the spiritual worldview changes, the sacred can be misunderstood or misused. Burial becomes a way to preserve the original intention, like placing an ancient manuscript into the earth so that its meaning remains untouched by time. Whatever the true reason, the result is a quiet beauty. Göbekli Tepe survived nearly intact, not because nature protected it, but because the very people who built it chose to enclose it with care. The site was closed like a sacred book whose last chapter had just been written, folded shut by hands that understood they were touching something larger than life, and beneath that earth, a subtle revelation appeared. The circles do not stand alone. They stack atop one another across different periods, like layers of a shifting consciousness evolving over 2,000 years. These temples lie not only in the ground, but in the unfolding path of the human mind. Each layer a step, an idea, a movement of spirit before agriculture, before villages, a journey of many layers, both material and spiritual. And it is this very journey that opens the way for us to step deeper into the quiet architecture of the sacred world they left behind. As excavations pushed deeper, meter by meter, a discovery emerged that reshaped everything we thought we knew about the site. Göbekli Tepe was not a single temple. It was many temples, built one atop another, erected, then buried, then rebuilt again on the very same ground. Each layer is its own chapter, recounting a journey of thought that stretched across nearly 2,000 years. The deepest layer, dating to around 9,600 before the Common Era, is the most magnificent. The central pillars of this era rise over 4 meters tall, weighing tens of tons, with carvings as sharp as if a blade had just touched the stone. The circles are broad, symmetrical, and overwhelmingly ceremonial. This may have been the age when seasonal hunter-gatherer groups still moved across the land and saw the hilltop as the place where they found one another, a spiritual center for the entire region. The layer above it, from roughly 9,000 to 8,800 before the Common Era, grows smaller. The pillars become simpler, the carvings fewer, and the layouts tighter. The ceremonial mindset remains, but its regional scale seems to have diminished. Some groups had already begun settling near fertile valleys, making large-scale gatherings less frequent. The rituals continued, but they no longer embraced all of Anatolia the way they once had. The youngest layer, dating between 8,500 and 8,200 before the Common Era, is so small it resembles underground shrines. Some circles contain only a handful of pillars, sometimes with no carvings at all, just plain stone standing quietly in the shadows. Ritual by this time appears more localized, serving small communities beginning to form the earliest settled life and experimental agriculture. These stacked layers reveal something profound. People once imagined the sacred within a vast shared space where many groups reunited. As communities dispersed and permanent settlements emerged, the sacred space contracted. Eventually, when wheat, water, and village life became the new center, the stone circles atop the hill became a memory, a spiritual inheritance from an era that had already faded. Seen as a whole, the layers are not simply structures replacing one another. They form a map of evolving consciousness. The large circles reflect an expansive society. The smaller circles reflect contraction. The burial layers reflect transition. There's no sudden rupture, only a long, slow, deeply felt journey. From a world shaped by the hunt to a world shaped by seeds and seasons. Each layer is a pause in thought, a moment when a community answered its own questions. What is the sacred? What is a community? Where do we belong in the wide universe? And the next natural question follows. Who were the people who built all these layers? To what groups did they belong? And across how many landscapes did they move? To find them, we must trace the fragments left behind by those nameless communities. A journey that opens in the next chapter. The greatest mystery of Göbekli Tepe is not in its towering pillars or exquisite carvings. It lies in the complete absence of human footprints around it. No houses, no tents, no hearths, no graves. Not a single trace suggesting that the builders ever lived on the very hill where they poured their strength into creating one of prehistory's most sacred monuments. This forced archaeologists to look outward, toward the wide valleys of Anatolia, to search for who these unnamed people truly were. Based on their stone tools, they belonged to Epipaleolithic and pre-pottery Neolithic A groups, between 9,600 and 8,800 before the Common Era. It was a fragile threshold between two worlds, when the last fully mobile hunter-gatherers were beginning to step into a semi-settled age. Evidence points to connections with the late Natufian groups of the Levant, as well as indigenous communities of Upper Mesopotamia. A vast cultural network stretched from southeastern Turkey to Syria, Jordan, and northern Iraq, a crossroads where no single group ruled, but every group passed through. The techniques they left behind show they were far from primitive. The 3 to 5 meter T-shaped pillars were carved from limestone using sophisticated flaking and splitting methods. Small grooves on the pillars reveal they combined wood and rope to raise them. No wheels, no metal, yet an imagination, a plan, and the collective discipline of a community with remarkable inner strength. Intriguingly, they did not come from one single place. Animal bones show that people from the north brought mountain game, people from the east brought gazelles, people from the west brought large birds. Pollen trapped in the fill layer reveals plants from multiple ecological zones. Göbekli Tepe was not the sanctuary of one tribe. It was the gathering ground of an entire region. That is why the carvings depict the foxes of the highlands, snakes of the semi-arid plains, Anatolian lions, Levantine leopards, and vultures from the southern woodlands. Each group brought symbols from the land they came from, weaving them into a shared sacred language. No writing, yet a symbolic system understood by all. What astonishes researchers most is the consistency of the artistic style across centuries. Even with many groups contributing, the T-pillars keep the same proportions. The carvings follow the same aesthetic. The architecture repeats the same circular model. This cannot be coincidence. It suggests they shared a unified tradition, a spiritual template passed through generations. Perhaps elders retold stories of the stone circles each hunting season. Perhaps the young, returning from long journeys, continued the work their elders had left unfinished. One thing is certain, they had no cities, yet they had a fixed meeting ground. No kings, yet they held a unified belief. No writing, yet they preserved a collective memory through symbols, and that was enough for them to build a monument far beyond their material needs. A spiritual center that shaped the cultural evolution of an entire region. But how did they live? What did they eat? Where did they shelter? How did they move with the seasons? And why were mobile people able to create such a fixed, enduring center? Those answers lie in the southern valleys, where traces of seasonal hunting camps scatter around ancient water sources. And to truly understand the people who left this monumental legacy, we must leave the sacred hill and step into the surrounding valleys, where the real rhythms of their lives remain, light as breath, yet enough to let us glimpse a world that vanished 12,000 years ago. Even though Göbekli Tepe was the greatest spiritual center of its region, the strange truth is that no one lived on the hill itself. No houses, no hearths, no everyday tools. It stood alone, like a sacred island, reached only when ritual called. To find human traces, archaeologists had to descend into the surrounding valleys, where water, game, and shade created the conditions for seasonal life. In valleys such as Harran, Karahan Tepe, and other water-rich depressions, human presence becomes clearer. Small fire pits, charred animal bones, sharp-edged stone tools. These are the faint remains of hunter-gatherer groups who lived scattered across the region between 9,600 and 8,800 before the Common Era. Each group numbered only a few dozen people, moving with the seasons, building temporary camps, then leaving when the herd shifted. Their lives were light as wind breath, yet strong enough to nourish a close, adaptable community. Their shelters, made of wood, branches, and animal hides, were never meant to endure millennia. But circular patches of hardened earth, tiny post holes, and compacted soil reveal that they built camps in the same places, season after season. These temporary, yet rhythmically stable structures formed the link between a mobile life and the immovable sacred hill rising in the distance. Inside the camps, daily life was simple, but never primitive. Adults divided tasks. Men hunted gazelles in winter and large birds in spring. Women gathered grass seeds and forest fruits. Children learned to read animal tracks and find hidden honey. Elders recited the stories of previous seasons, what had been seen, what had been lost, what must never be forgotten. Perhaps these very stories, repeated around countless night fires, became the symbolic language carved into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe. Archaeological traces also reveal a diverse toolkit: flint blades for slicing meat, stone axes for splitting wood, tiny but razor-sharp spear points for hunting birds and small game. Though they lacked pottery, they cooked by lining earth pits with hides and dropping in heated stones, a technique both simple and refined, showing exceptional adaptability to the semi-arid Anatolian landscape. What matters most is that daily life in the valleys and ritual life on the hill were never separate. Every successful hunt, every year of generous rain, every danger overcome became a reason to gather on the sacred hill. The valley camps existed to sustain the community. The stone circles atop the hill existed to sustain its spirit. A dual rhythm, one of survival, one of meaning, repeating across thousands of years. And within that rhythm, we begin to feel something deeper. Though their lives were always in motion, they carried within them a fixed point to return to, a place where firelight, song, and belief blended into a quiet current, connecting humans to the sacred. From the peaceful valley floor, the hill appeared like a distant calling, a place where, on special nights, flames, smoke, and mysterious rites lit up the darkness, revealing a world so ancient that with just a gentle touch, you could almost hear the heartbeat of 12,000 years ago. At certain strange moments of the year, when the wind shifted directions, when the gazelle herds began leaving the valleys, or when the first rains changed the scent of the earth, the hill of Göbekli Tepe slowly became a point of gathering. From scattered hunting camps across the region, small groups made their quiet ascent, carrying game meat, flint tools, bone ornaments, and the stories of the closing season. On the limestone slopes, the wind carried a feeling both familiar and sacred, as if the place had been waiting for them. As the sun sank in the west, the twin T-shaped pillars cast long shadows across the ground, silhouettes of guardians without faces, yet possessing a presence stronger than any human figure. People believed the stone circle was the border between the world they lived in and the world where the unseen dwelled. No walls, no roof, yet stepping across that boundary meant leaving the everyday world and entering a space where wind, firelight, and the idea of the sacred blended into an entirely different realm of feeling. Archaeological traces suggest the rituals began with simple offerings: bird feathers, tiny bone pieces, polished stones. Objects once hung from the grooves and knobs carved onto the T-pillars. They no longer survive, but their marks remain, quiet testimonies that this place was once filled with whispered prayers. Then came the fire. Ash around the entrances shows that hundreds of pieces of wood were burned, turning the stone circle into an open-air sanctuary beneath the night sky. In the flickering glow, the carved animals, foxes, aurochs, snakes, vultures, seemed to move with the shifting light, as if their symbolic forms briefly returned to life during the sacred hours. They may have sung. They may have told stories passed only by voice. No one knows for certain. But the rhythm of the ritual did not depend on words. It lived in the harmony between things: the wind, the fire, the soft shuffling of feet on the earth, and the collective gaze of dozens of people fixed on the twin pillars at the center. Large bone pits revealed the symbolic role of shared meat. This was not a meal for survival. It was a ceremony of unity. To share meat was to share memory, fear, and belief. In a world without writing, eating together was a vow, a way of affirming that they belonged to something larger than themselves. A few hollow bird bones found nearby may once have been simple flutes. Their sharp, cold, far-reaching tones, echoing across the hill in the night wind, might have carried participants into a state of sacred focus, lifting them momentarily out of the rhythms of ordinary hunter life. When the ritual ended, they left the hill before sunrise, returning it to absolute silence. Only faint footprints on soft soil and the drifting scent of cooled ash remained. A sacred place did not need people to stay. It lived through moments, through the times when the community returned to tighten the invisible thread between humans and the unseen world. And when we imagine those silent nights, one truth becomes clear. The greatest value of Göbekli Tepe may not lie in the stones themselves, but in the invisible meanings people placed into those stones. Meanings we can feel, but can no longer name. And in witnessing these quiet rituals, we begin to touch a deeper layer, the layer of sacred imagination, where humans first learned to shape what they could not yet see, to name what they did not yet understand, and to transform emotion into symbols that would outlive them by 12,000 years. What makes Göbekli Tepe so extraordinary is not only its pillars or engineering, it is the presence of something untouchable, the awakening of the sacred mind. Between 9,600 and 8,200 before the Common Era, humanity crossed a turning point in thought. People began seeing the world not only with their eyes, but with ideas. And on the white, wind-carved hill of Anatolia, that idea found its first architectural form. Before Göbekli Tepe, cave paintings recorded only what humans saw: herds of animals, running paths, hoof prints. But here, humans did not recreate the world, they defined it. They gathered symbols, pillars, open space, and light, placing them into a deliberate design. It was the moment when sacred imagination stepped beyond storytelling and became architecture. From this point forward, religion, myth, and abstract thought finally had a stage. The T-shaped pillars have no faces, and it is precisely this facelessness that becomes their strongest language. The sacred was not given a human form. It was left as a space people had to perceive within themselves. This was a form of thinking that rose beyond the individual, beyond the visible shape. The builders created the frame for the sacred to enter, instead of giving the divine a fixed appearance. The carved animals do not depict hunting scenes. They stand alone as symbols. The snake as transformation, the fox as cunning, the vulture as the mediator between life and death, the aurochs as raw power. Placed within the ceremonial circle, they become the first alphabet of spirituality, the characters of an unseen world. This kind of thinking opened something immense, the ability to create symbolic reality. Humans began seeing from the inside, not just with senses. They raised stones not for shelter, but to create a space for meaning. They gathered not only to feast, but to share a collective dream, a dream of a world driven by forces invisible to the naked eye. This marks the dividing line between humans and every other species, the ability to create the sacred. No animal builds a temple to speak to the unseen. No creature arranges stone to preserve the memory of the soul. But at Göbekli Tepe, humans revealed that their power lay not only in tools, but in imagination, the force that could unite hundreds of people and drive them to pour thousands of hours into an idea. When Göbekli Tepe was buried, the sacred mind did not disappear. It followed people into the valleys, blended into farming, settlement, and the smaller shrines of the early agricultural world. From there, worship spread, richer, more complex. But its roots remained on that white hill, where humanity first realized the depth of its own spirit. And from that light, a mystic shadow opens, a reminder that the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe challenge not only science, but the very limits of understanding. Some parts of the past were shaped to never be fully decoded. Perhaps it is precisely these unanswered questions that keep Göbekli Tepe alive, like a thin crack between two worlds, where our imagination can still slip through and touch what our ancestors once chose to keep hidden. Even after decades of study, most of Göbekli Tepe's mysteries still lie beneath untouched soil. The exposed stone circles are only the visible tip of a much greater design. What remains buried? The unopened layers of temples, the unseen symbols, the untold stories, still sleeps beneath the earth, as if the site wished to keep a portion of its memory for itself. The most perplexing question is its true purpose. No texts, no myths, no later traditions to compare. What survives is only symbolism, and symbols open more doorways than they close. Some believe it was a place of ancestor worship. Others see it as an early observatory of stars. Some think it was a ritual space linked to death. Each theory holds weight, yet none is large enough to embrace all the evidence. Another mystery lies in the gap between its age and its sophistication. Why is it that between 9,600 and 8,800 before the Common Era, when people lived in scattered seasonal camps, they built a sanctuary more advanced than temples erected thousands of years later? And why did the circles shrink and simplify by 8,500 to 8,200 before the Common Era, as if their refinement faded with a shift in worldview or environment? Perhaps they were stepping into a new era, one where the sacred moved from the hilltop into the valley. One of the greatest enigmas is numerical. Roughly 70% of Göbekli Tepe is still underground. The largest structures may not have been uncovered yet. What will appear when the next layer of earth is removed? A grander circle? An entirely new symbol unknown in archaeology? Or a form of architecture that reshapes our understanding of the sacred at the end of the Ice Age? Even life around the region remains partly in shadow. We do not know the rhythm of their gatherings, what summoned them to the hill, or which stories carried them through the seasons. Stone tools only tell us they were there, not why they returned to the same place for nearly 2 millennia. Then comes the question of the ending. Why did they stop? No war, no fire, no destruction. They simply reduced the scale of ritual and then buried everything, as if closing a book without tearing a single page. The silence of that decision carries an emotion hard to name, as though they wished to protect the site from time, or perhaps from the interpretations of future generations. But perhaps the deepest mystery does not lie in the stones at all, but in the minds of the people who raised them. They didn't see the world as a backdrop for survival, but as a surface filled with meaning. An animal was not just an animal, it was a natural force. A circle was not just architecture, it was a gathering point of spirit. Fire did not simply light the dark, it named the unseen. Göbekli Tepe, in this sense, is not a monument. It is a prayer built in stone, offered to the sky. And when you stand among the pillars today, surrounded by silence and wind, the question the monument leaves us with is not archaeological, but human. In a world drenched in noise and light, do we still possess the capacity to see the sacred as they once did? It is not a question asking for an answer, but for stillness, as if Göbekli Tepe itself is testing whether the modern mind can still open the door to the world of the unseen. When Göbekli Tepe was buried between 8,200 and 8,000. Before the Common Era, it was not a full stop. It was a comma in the story of an age. The site was not abandoned. It was closed gently, like a sacred text that had completed its purpose. The people who climbed the hill for nearly 2,000 years now shifted into the valleys, where water, soil, and the first cultivated seeds revealed a different future, the future of settlement and agriculture. From a grand ceremonial center, spiritual life gradually became smaller, more intimate, rooted within each household. The massive stone circles gave way to flat-roofed homes, where rituals took place beside the hearth. They no longer needed vast architecture to gather the entire region. The spirit of Göbekli Tepe did not disappear. It transformed, moving from the hilltop into every new shelter rising in the valley. Its imprint continued through later cultures. The carved animals, snakes, vultures, aurochs, foxes, reappeared on Jericho pottery, on clay figures from Çatalhöyük, and in the earliest myths of Mesopotamia. The snake became a symbol of rebirth. The vulture became the guide of souls. The lion and fox stepped into myth as ancient archetypes of power and cunning. Even as languages changed, these symbols preserved the spiritual rhythm born on that ancient hill. Structures across the Levant and Anatolia, small altars, faceless figurines, isolated stone circles, show that Göbekli Tepe's way of thinking lived on for generations. Not through identical shapes, but through a shared worldview. That the world is understood through symbols, and symbols are the bridge between humans and the nameless. Even the circular gathering pattern, where people stood facing a shared center, survived into agricultural life. Neolithic meeting spaces kept that arrangement, though scaled down. The sense of reunion once felt on the hilltop became the everyday rhythm of village life. Seasonal councils, coming-of-age rites, funerary gatherings, harvest celebrations. The sacred no longer sat alone on a hill. It flowed through the ordinary pulse of daily life. The rituals of light, once tied to sunrise at Göbekli Tepe, reappeared as agricultural calendars. Watching the sky, reading weather, tracking the sun's cycles became the foundation for farming. The sacred mindset of the Hunter Age transformed into the cyclical mindset of settled society. Everything remained connected, like water changing its shape but never losing its course. Today, when humanity looks back at Göbekli Tepe, we see not only a buried monument, but an ancient imprint of ourselves. The need for meaning, the need to gather, the need to build symbols to speak with the vastness around us. The site had slept beneath the earth for 10,000 years, yet its idea has never faded. And as the story nears its close, we realize some monuments do not live through stone. They live through influence, flowing across time, across people, across imagination, like embers beneath ash, waiting for a single breath to glow again. When we look back on the full arc of Göbekli Tepe, from the first stone circles raised in the pale light of the post-Ice Age world to the day it was buried 10,000 years ago, we do not simply see an archaeological site. We see a mirror held up to humanity at a moment when people had not yet learned to plant seeds, but had already begun seeking meaning. Between 9,600 and 8,200, before the Common Era, scattered hunting groups made their way to this hill not for survival, but for spirit. They raised T-shaped pillars like faceless beings, carved into stone, the animals that held symbolic power, and shaped circles where people could stand together in silence and feel their smallness beneath the vast sky. That was the moment something new appeared. Humans building not for shelter, but to find their place within the universe. The beauty of Göbekli Tepe lies in its deliberate silence. No writing, yet a full language of symbols. No kings, yet an unmistakable communal agreement. No walls, yet a clear order of ritual. The monument stands as a question carved in stone, a question the ancients pressed into the white earth. Who are we in this vast world? And that question opened the age of abstract thought, the ability to see the world not only through the eyes, but through ideas. When the age of hunting gave way to settlement and the first wheat roots took hold, people no longer needed to gather on the hill. They carried the sacred down into the valleys, weaving it into hearths, homes, and rituals tied to the seasons. Göbekli Tepe was buried not because it was abandoned, but because it had passed on its flame. Its spirit lived on in the architecture of Çatalhöyük, in the small altars of the Levant, and in the creation myths of Mesopotamia. Today, standing among the tall, silent pillars, we see not only the past, we see the moment the human mind began questioning itself, began dreaming, imagining, and connecting things that could not be touched. We see the birth of symbol, of myth, of meaning, the forces that would shape all of human history. What matters is not what the ancients believed, but that they began to believe. Not how they understood the world, but that they wanted to understand it. That moment, a group of people standing inside a stone circle at night, sensing the unseen, opened a journey that continues to reach us today. As we close the story of Göbekli Tepe, we are not shutting a book, we are placing our hand on an ancient mirror. In that mirror, the reflection is not stone or carved animals, but the human being itself, a creature seeking to step beyond survival and reach a deeper realm of existence. And in the last light settling over the stone circles, one faint whisper seems to drift across 12,000 years. The sacred does not live in the monument, but in those who knew how to name it. This is not an ending. It is the moment we begin to hear our own echo more clearly in the endless river of time.